Today's story is about a murder, but it starts to feel like it's sort of a typical true crime case until you get to the end. I'm telling you right now, you will not be able to guess who the mastermind was. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late on the night of October 13th, 2008, a 43-year-old woman named Hua Sai-hui sat in her parked car in a dark, desolate area off the side of Highway 61 in New Taipei City, Taiwan. Hua rolled down her driver's side window and then turned the engine off. And for a second, she just sat there and let the warm breeze blow in on her face. It wasn't often that she got a moment alone because she had 3 kids who all lived at home. So she just took a moment to enjoy the silence. And then eventually, she turned to the center console and she grabbed a piece of paper that was sitting there. And she tore the paper into tiny pieces and then tossed them out the open window. But when she did that, she didn't realize that the breeze kind of blew back in at the same time, and a few of those ripped up pieces actually found their way back inside of her car and settled in the pocket on the driver's side door. A little while later, around 3 a.m., a Coast Guard officer drove along Highway 61 doing his regular nighttime patrol. He went under an overpass and into an area where there weren't very many streetlights. And there, in the relative darkness, he saw something that was pretty odd. There was this gray sedan parked half on and half off the road. Intrigued, the Coast Guard officer pulled up behind the car, parked, and got out to investigate. The sedan's lights and engine were both off, and so the officer wondered if maybe this car had been abandoned. But as he got closer, he saw that the driver's side window was wide open. Now again, it was pretty dark, but the officer could make out the shape of what appeared to be a woman sitting inside the car in the driver's seat. And so the Coast Guard officer took out his flashlight to wake this person up, but when he shined the light into the car, he immediately reeled back in horror because the woman was not asleep. Her entire head and her chest were covered in blood. A few minutes later, a police officer named Guo Hui-wen arrived on the scene along with a small team of other police officers and several EMTs. The EMTs quickly determined what basically everybody on scene already knew, which was the woman inside the car was dead. She had a small circular wound right below her left ear that authorities immediately recognized as a bullet wound. Officer Guo immediately pushed his men out to secure the scene. And then once the cordon was in place, they began investigating. The first thing Guo did was just to look more closely at the woman's body. He saw there was a bullet casing on the ground nearby, and also what appeared to be some bullet fragments in the car, like little bits of shiny metal, like copper. But there was no gun. And so at this point, Officer Guo and his team realized they were very likely dealing with a murder. But as he stood there sort of taking it all in and looking at the car and the body, he started to realize that the whole scene just seemed off. First, there were no skid marks behind the car's tires, so it appeared like the woman must have pulled over in a controlled way, not like she'd been, forced off the road by another car. Second, her window was all the way down. The driver's side window was completely down, which meant either she'd been driving with the window down to begin with, or after she had pulled over, or while pulling over, she had rolled it down. And then thirdly, there was no evidence of a struggle, or really any sign that this woman had been panicked in any way before she was ultimately shot. I mean, she hadn't even dropped her phone or taken off her seatbelt. And so overall, it just sort of seemed like this woman had been remarkably calm in her final moments, like she had no idea she was about to be killed. And this made Officer Guo think that whoever shot her was very likely somebody she knew and trusted. And so Guo knew he needed to identify this woman and then determine who was close to her. So he took down the license plate number of the car and he was about to go run it through a system to see who the car belonged to. But suddenly another officer came running over and they told him they'd found something really weird inside the car. They weren't sure if what they found was related to the crime, but in the pocket on the driver's side of the door, they'd found 4 small scraps of paper. And each scrap had what looked like numbers or word fragments handwritten on them. They said 65, Dao Leo, Z, and Da. Now, none of these fragments appeared to have any meaning on their own, They likely, needed to be a part of a bigger piece of paper to make sense. In fact, honestly, the words were just pieces of words rather than actual full words themselves. And also, when they began sort of arranging the 4 pieces to see if they could, find meaning in these words and this number, they couldn't do it. It just was all sort of nonsense. And so Officer Guo, he figured these scraps were likely just garbage, but as a precaution, he had his officers bag them up as evidence just in case. Let's take a moment to say thank you to our sponsor, Sherwin-Williams. Choosing a paint color can be easy when you have the right tools. Sherwin-Williams offers several solutions for finding the perfect hue, including color chips, peel and stick samples, and color-to-go samples, so you can try color before you buy and find your perfect color with confidence. Your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store delivers color and project expertise, a product for every need, and personalized customer experience. So my wife and I have been renovating our basement to make it our primary hangout space for the family. And in the basement is a custom entertainment center that we had installed, and it was supposed to get painted by professional painters until my wife said, well, hey, why don't we make this our big project over spring break to paint it ourselves? Now, of course, I was thrilled, as any good husband would be, and so what we did is we went to our local Sherwin-Williams store, and let me tell you, the entire experience really was awesome. The staff was very knowledgeable, and they helped us pick the right paint color and finish, the amount of paint, all the supplies we would need, and they even gave us some how-to painting tips. And so my wife and I get home from Sherwin-Williams, and we start our one-day project that quickly evolved into a multi-day project. But at the end of those days, it came out great, and we could not have done it without the help of Sherwin-Williams. And now the entertainment center in the basement is the focus piece of the room, and I can proudly say we did that thanks to Sherwin-Williams. Head to swsamples.com to order color samples for your next project. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. A few hours later, Officer Guo, along with a member of his team, walked into this huge apartment complex in New Taipei City that was about 40 miles away from where they had found the woman inside of the gray sedan earlier that morning. They went to a specific apartment and they knocked on the door. And after a moment, a middle-aged man opened the door up, and he looked very surprised to see police standing at his door. Officer Guo asked this man if his name was Xu Bicheng, and the man nodded and said yes. By this point, Officer Guo and his partner had identified the murder victim. She was 43-year-old Hua Sai-hui. And when they'd started looking into Hua's relationships, they'd learned that she lived in this apartment with her 3 kids and the man who had opened the door, Xu Bicheng. He was her ex-husband. Even though the couple had actually gotten divorced 5 years earlier, they had ultimately decided to continue living together and co-parenting. As Hua's ex-husband, Xu was an obvious person of interest in this murder. But at this point, Officer Guo wasn't sure how much Xu even knew. So he had to be careful how he approached the conversation. Officer Guo started by introducing himself and his partner, and then asked Xu if he had spoken to his ex-wife recently. And Xu shook his head and said he actually hadn't spoken to her since the previous night. But he did say that their last conversation had definitely been kind of weird. He said that the previous night, around 8:45 p.m., Hua had left to go to this meeting with a pawn shop owner on the opposite side of the city. He said that she owed this pawn shop owner a lot of money, and they were supposed to be discussing a repayment plan. But around 9:30 p.m., while she was on her way to this meeting, Xu said that Hua had actually called him to say she was out on Highway 61 and another car was now following her. Xiu had told her that very likely this was just somebody driving a similar route as her, like this was not a cause for concern. And so ultimately, Hua had sort of agreed and said okay and hung up. And according to Xiu, he tried calling Hua back a bit later, but she hadn't picked up. Xiu said he actually called Hua an additional 10 more times after this, but she never answered, and so Xiu said he really didn't know what became of his ex-wife. He didn't know how the meeting went, he didn't know where she was. Now, after hearing this, Officer Gua's first reaction was sort of to be like, that's absurd. If Xiu knew that Hua was potentially being followed, at night no less, while she's out by herself, going to this relatively high-stakes meeting with this pawn shop owner, and then she suddenly stops answering her phone, why wouldn't Xiu have eventually called the police? Or at least tried to go look for her? Instead, he'd just called Hua a bunch of times, and then when she didn't answer, he just shrugged the whole thing off. The mother of his kids, he just sort of said, oh, no big deal. It just felt like a really bizarre way for somebody to react to this situation. So, Officer Gua watched Xiu very carefully as he told him, what happened. He said he was very sorry, but early that morning, they'd found his ex-wife murdered inside of her car on the side of the highway. When Xiu heard this, his eyes went wide and he began to tremble. And, from Gua's perspective, it looked like sort of a shocked response, a genuine shocked response that he can't believe what he's being told. But he also really couldn't read the guy. He couldn't tell if this was genuine or if he was just performing. Either way, Gua knew what he needed to do next was follow up on Xiu's story and see if maybe he could poke some holes in it. Following this interview, Gua and his team asked the manager of the apartment complex for any available surveillance footage so they could see if Hua really did leave the apartment when Xiu said she did. And the manager was able to recover some footage from inside the apartment complex elevator. And while it did prove that Hua left around 8:45 p.m., like Xiu had said, it also showed something else that struck Officer Gua as kind of strange. In the video, Hua rode down the elevator, supposedly on her way to meet with this pawn shop owner, but for some reason, her ex-husband, Xiu, rode the elevator with her. And during this ride, Xiu kissed Hua for 8 seconds straight, and then hugged her until the elevator stopped and the doors opened. Now, to most people, this would just look like a sort of normal, tender moment between a loving couple. But it was odd in this case, really for 2 reasons. First, because Hua and Xiu were divorced. As far as Gua understood, they were definitely not a romantic couple at all anymore. And then secondly, it was also weird because in Taiwanese culture, public displays of affection are very taboo, especially among older generations. Like, it would be really uncommon for a middle-aged couple to kiss and hug pretty much anywhere except inside their own home. So, Officer Gua felt like, the only reason that made sense for Xiu to behave the way he had on the elevator was if he knew something bad was about to happen to his ex-wife. And as they continued investigating Xiu's story, they found more problems with it. They learned that the pawn shop owner did exist, and Hua did owe him a lot of money, but when they actually spoke to him, he said he had not been planning to meet with Hua on the night of her death. He didn't know what Xiu was talking about. Police also got access to surveillance footage from Highway 61 where Hua's body had been found. Now, the cameras didn't cover the part of the road where the murder actually took place, but police were able to get footage of Hua driving along the highway at 9:30 p.m., the time Xiu said she had told him she was being followed. But on this video, there was clearly no other car following Hua. Now, it was technically possible that Hua had lied to her ex-husband Xiu for some reason, but to Officer Gua, it seemed much more likely that Xiu was now lying to him and making up, the story about the car following his ex-wife. After learning all of this, Officer Gua and his team went back and looked at all the surveillance footage from the apartment complex, and they also got access to Xiu's cell phone GPS records to see if they could track his movements on the night of the murder. But what they found really only complicated things, because according to the footage and Xiu's cell phone pings, he was inside of his apartment all night. There was no way he was the one who shot Hua. But to Officer Gua, this didn't mean Xiu was innocent. He wondered if maybe Xiu had hired someone to commit the murder on his behalf. He didn't know, but he just felt like Xiu had to be involved. But that theory still left a lot of unanswered questions. Like, why would Xiu have wanted Hua dead in the first place? And why would Hua have calmly pulled over and opened her car window for a hitman potentially? And so Officer Gua thought about it for a little bit, and then he had an idea. Maybe the person Xiu hired wasn't a stranger. Maybe the hitman was somebody Hua knew and trusted. Several months later, Officer Gua and one of his teammates were sitting inside of an office in a high-rise building in New Taipei City. They were in front of this huge desk, and behind this desk was the man who worked in this office. And he was Hua's brother. So Officer Gua and his team were still working off the idea that whoever killed Hua likely knew her personally. So they'd spent the last few months methodically tracking down and interviewing everyone in her cell phone contacts list. Now, so far, they had not found any new suspects. But they had learned some pretty interesting stuff. Apparently, Hua had not just been in debt to that pawn shop owner. She also owed money to multiple banks, to friends, to family members. She even owed money to some very shady black market lenders. Altogether, she had the equivalent of nearly $500,000 in debt. And knowing all of this actually made Hua and her ex-husband Xiu's relationship make more sense. Several people had told Gua that the reason Hua and Xiu had gotten divorced was not because they wanted to. It was because Hua's credit was terrible because of all this debt, and Xiu wanted to keep his finances separate from hers. And so by all accounts, the couple, despite being divorced, were still very much in love, and they were both devoted to each other and to their kids. And so this new information had kind of left Officer Gua and his team floundering, because Xiu had initially seemed so suspicious, but Gua still didn't have any hard evidence against him, and now he didn't even seem to have a motive for him. So now, as Gua sat inside of this office across from Hua's brother, he just hoped that some new piece of information would come to light. Gua and his partner asked the brother to please tell them everything he knew about Hua, her marriage, and anything else he thought might be relevant. The brother nodded and started talking. But pretty quickly, what he was saying just sounded a lot like all the other stuff that Gua already knew. Like, this was not new information, it was the same as always. And so as the brother just kind of began to talk, Gua's eyes sort of left the brother and began wandering around the room. And eventually, Gua's gaze landed on a bookshelf behind the brother, behind the desk. He noticed there was a piece of paper sticking out from between two books on this shelf. Now, Gua could only see a little bit of it, but he could tell that there was handwriting on the paper that looked familiar. And so, without saying anything, like while the brother is still talking, Gua got up, walked around to the bookshelf, and he pulled out that piece of paper. And right away, as he's looking at it, his heart began to race, because he saw that the handwriting on this piece of paper was the same handwriting that were on those 4 little scraps of paper that were found at the crime scene, those pieces of paper that were sort of ruled out as trash. He's seeing this is definitely the same handwriting. But more than that, Gua is seeing that literally the actual words or portions of words and the number that were on those fragments are literally on this piece of paper. Clearly, he's looking at a duplicate of whatever document was in the car that got ripped up. He only had 4 little pieces before. Now he's looking at the full copy of that document. And as Gua looked over this document, it was like everything just snapped into place. Those fragments that he saw, those things that were found in the car that now have been laid out in this document, those were bits and pieces of street names and addresses. The full message that Gua was now looking at was actually a set of geographical directions. And the directions would lead whoever was following these directions to the actual location where Hua was murdered. And so after this discovery, the police very quickly figured out what happened to Hua, like who the mastermind was behind her murder. But amazingly, the mastermind was not Hua's brother, despite this document being found in his office. No, it would turn out that the story of Hua's murder was far darker and far more tragic than anybody could have imagined. It all began 1 month before Hua's death. That was when 3 people who all wanted Hua dead met up. That was Hua's brother, Hua's ex-husband, and the mastermind. And the 3 of them, once they got together, they began formulating a plan. Now, what they all decided was none of them wanted to get their hands dirty, so they would hire a hitman. They decided that once they had this hitman, they would kill Hua in a neutral location. They would shoot her on the side of the highway. And they chose a date for her execution that was convenient, a time when that section of the road would be basically empty and also was an area where there were no cameras and few streetlights. And so on the night that Hua is going to be executed, the reason Hua's ex-husband, Xiu, rode down the apartment elevator with her and hugged her and kissed her in this big display of affection was because he knew what was going to happen to her. He was basically saying goodbye. And then after Hua left the apartment, Xiu contacted Hua's brother, who then called the hitman. And then the hitman used the directions the brother had written out for him, those same directions that Hua had found in his office. The hitman used those to get to the location where they were going to kill Hua. And when he got there, he just pulled off to the side of the road and he waited. A little while later, the hitman saw Hua's gray sedan pass by him and come to a stop on the side of the road. And so at this point, the hitman got out of his car, he walked up alongside Hua's car, her window was down, he pulled out a gun, and he shot her. It would turn out the 3rd person who met up with the ex-husband and the brother who wanted Hua dead, who was the mastermind behind Hua's execution, was Hua herself. The reason Hua had those directions in her car that she ultimately ripped up at the end and tried to dispose of is because she needed directions to go to the place where she was going to get killed. It's why the hitman got out of the car, walked right up and killed her with no fight. She had rolled down the window and was waiting. Police later determined that Hua had taken out a life insurance policy on herself that was worth so much money it would pay off all of her debt and leave her family with a lot of money left over. She'd planned her own murder as a sort of self-sacrifice in the hopes of giving her family a better life. She'd ultimately convinced her ex-husband and brother to help in exchange for a cut of the money. But her plan didn't really work out. Hua's death was ruled a suicide, not a homicide, so the life insurance company didn't pay out anything to her family. Xiu, Hua's brother, and the hitman all faced a number of charges, including facilitating suicide and fraud. They each received between 6.5 and 7 years in prison. In the early afternoon of Wednesday, August 10th, 2005, 18-year-old Eliza Parsi sat on her bed in her home in Staten Island, New York, flipping through a fashion magazine. The house was quiet because Eliza's mother, Seema, was at work. So Eliza had the whole house to herself, at least for a little while, until she herself went to work. Eliza had graduated high school just a few months ago, and now she was working as a clerk at a moving company to try to save up some money for college, and also to eventually move into Manhattan to pursue her dream of working in the fashion industry. However, Eliza did feel a bit guilty about moving away, because it would mean leaving her mom all alone in this big house. And there wasn't really any other family nearby because both of her parents were from Israel. Seema had divorced Eliza's father about 1.5 years ago, and her father had left New York and moved back to Israel. Eliza also had 2 half-brothers who were Seema's sons from her first marriage, and one of them was back in Israel as well, and the other, Eliza's 27-year-old half-brother Raviv, lived just a short drive away in another part of the city. But Eliza and Seema rarely saw him because he was married with a new baby and lived with his in-laws, and so he basically had a whole new family. And also, Raviv had been put in charge of the Parsi family's kosher cookie business, which was really struggling. So he was really busy and always stressed about the company, and he really just didn't make it out to Staten Island very often. Eliza flipped through the last few pages of her magazine and then noticed that it was time to get ready for her 2 p.m. shift at work. But first, she wanted to check and see if she had any new messages on her internet dating profiles. So she put her magazine down, went over to her desk, and logged into her computer. So in 2005, internet dating was just starting to take off. and Eliza had made profiles on a few different dating and meetup websites just to see what would happen. And before long, she had found herself messaging and meeting up with men from all around New York City. But she'd never told her mother about this because she knew that her mother would not approve of Eliza dating men who were not from their same Orthodox Jewish faith. And Eliza knew this for a fact because it's exactly what had happened with her previous boyfriend at the public high school that she went to. Eliza had friends from all different backgrounds, and she had started seriously dating a Muslim boy named Hassan, but her family had really disapproved of their relationship entirely because of his faith. And so eventually, Eliza just couldn't take the family pressure anymore, and she'd broken up with him. And so now, Eliza was much more secretive about her personal life. She would come up with these phony reasons why she was going to other neighborhoods, but really it was just so she could go on dates or hook up with guys for fun without her mom knowing. And also, she had even begun secretly bringing some of them to her house in Staten Island. But she was always very careful to sneak them in through the back door when her mom was at work, so she wouldn't get caught. Now, Eliza logged into her account, and she saw there were a few messages from some guys, and so she responded to them, and then after that, she headed into the bathroom to take a shower before work. And a few minutes later, when Eliza finished her shower and turned off the water, she heard a noise coming from outside the bathroom. Now, she couldn't tell what it was. Earlier that afternoon, she'd heard a landscaping crew working at the house next door with some really loud leaf blowers, but this noise was different. It was like a weird banging sound. So, curious, Eliza got out of the shower, wrapped a towel tightly around herself, and opened the bathroom door to go see what was going on. That night, around 7:30 p.m., Eliza's mother, Seema, arrived back at the house that she shared with Eliza. She turned her key in the front lock and tried to push the door open, but it would only open a couple of inches because it felt like there was something on the other side that was blocking it from opening any further. Now, Seema had no idea what this could be, and so she just began shoving against the door, and eventually she pushed it open wide enough that she could slip inside. And when she did, the first thing she noticed was that the thing that had been blocking the door was this heavy mirror. But before Seema's mind could really process how this mirror wound up here, she turned on the lights and saw that her living room was absolutely destroyed. Furniture was overturned, cabinets were flung open, and papers were just strewn everywhere. Seema immediately felt her heart start pounding because she realized that clearly somebody had broken in and robbed the place. But then her second thought was, where is Eliza? Where's my daughter? Because Seema knew that Eliza had been home at least part of the day, and what if this had happened when Eliza was here all alone? And so Seema began calling out for her daughter, but there was no answer. And so she followed the chaos upstairs and noticed that the door to Eliza's room was closed. So she went over to the door and put her hand on the knob and tried to open it up, but it was locked. And Seema knew that this was just not normal. Eliza never locked this door. And so now, Seema's thinking something has happened here. Something bad has happened here. And so sort of in a panic, Seema just began banging on the door, screaming her daughter's name, hoping she would answer, but it was silent. And so after a couple of seconds, Seema pulled out her phone and called the moving company where her daughter worked. And her stomach dropped when Eliza's boss told her that her daughter had not shown up to work that day. And so with trembling hands, Seema got off that call and dialed 911. About an hour later, Detective Michael Kenny of the New York City Police Department drove slowly down a neighborhood street in Staten Island. Ahead, he could see his destination, a 3-story house with yellow crime scene tape across the front yard. But it was hard to get close because the street was now swarming with neighbors and just random people who had come out to see what was going on. So Kenny parked a few houses down and then headed for the house on foot. And when he got there, he was met by 2 patrol officers. And they told Kenny that they had responded to a call about a robbery and then had to break down a door of a locked bedroom where they ultimately found the dead body of 18-year-old Eliza Parsi, who lived in the house with her mother, Seema. The officers explained that when they had checked the rest of the scene, they had noticed that the entire house was basically torn apart. But they hadn't found any signs of forced entry. The officers then directed Kenny's attention over to Seema, who was standing nearby with a small group of people, presumably family or neighbors. Kenny knew he would have to talk to her. But first, he needed to get a better sense of just what was going on inside of this house. So Kenny made his way in the front door and surveyed the living room, where some crime scene techs had already begun processing the scene. The room had definitely been torn apart. But as Kenny looked closer, he could see that a lot of valuable items were sitting untouched and out in the open, like the TV and the stereo, which was unusual for a burglary. Next, Kenny walked up the stairs and into Eliza's room, where more techs were collecting evidence, and the first thing he noticed was that this room also looked ransacked. There were clothes and pillows thrown everywhere, and the mattress had been pulled off the bed frame and was leaning up against the wall. And on the floor in the middle of the room was Eliza's body. She was lying on the ground, and she was naked, and there was a towel sort of bunched up underneath her. Kenny asked one of the techs if this is exactly how the body had been found, and the tech said no. When they first got to the scene, Eliza had actually been underneath the mattress and also had a pillow over her face, but they had to move both of those things out of the way in order to actually examine her body, which was why, the mattress was now up against the wall. Kenny knelt down over Eliza's body, but he couldn't see any visible cause of death, like a bullet or knife wounds or bruising, which could mean that maybe she was suffocated. Maybe the pillow that was on her face that they had removed was what was used to kill her. Kenny turned and asked the tech if they had found any evidence of physical injury, and the tech pointed to just a few tiny drops of blood that were on the towel underneath Eliza. Now, they were very small and they could have been old, like maybe somebody had cut themselves shaving, but all these details, a naked young woman, the mattress, the pillow, the blood, it made Kenny concerned that Eliza might have been a victim of sexual assault before she was killed. So Kenny told the tech to make sure that the blood from the towel, as well as any other bodily fluids they could find, were collected as evidence, because they might belong to Eliza's killer. A few minutes later, Kenny emerged from the house and began walking over to speak with Seema. And Seema, she was crying onto the shoulder of a young man, and the minute this young man saw Kenny, he stepped forward and started demanding to know why the police were keeping them away from Eliza's body, and also why the cops weren't out there arresting his sister's killer. So Kenny just took a deep breath, because this man was obviously Eliza's brother, and it was understandable why he was so upset. Kenny knew that a lot of times grief turned into anger in these situations. So Kenny calmly explained that in order to find Eliza's killer, he first needed information, starting with where he and Seema had been that day. And this got both Raviv and Seema to calm down right away, because they seemed to realize that Kenny might actually be suspicious of them. So the man lowered his voice, and he introduced himself as Raviv, and then he and Seema began answering Kenny's questions. Seema said she'd been at work all day and that there were plenty of coworkers who could say as much, and Raviv explained that he too had been working all day, delivering baked goods all around Long Island. Kenny made notes so he could double-check all their information later. And then he asked if either of them knew anybody who might have had a reason to want to harm Eliza, and Kenny saw them share a very knowing glance. Then Raviv turned to Kenny and said he should look into Eliza's ex-boyfriend, Hassan, who none of them liked or trusted. And as Kenny started jotting these details down, Seema chimed in and added that her daughter had told her about something really bizarre that Hassan had done recently. Early one morning a few weeks ago, Eliza had woken up to find Hassan sitting at the end of her bed, just staring at her, like he'd been watching her sleep. And the whole thing had absolutely terrified Eliza because she had no idea how he'd even gotten into the house. She certainly hadn't invited him over, and their house was always locked overnight. And then before Detective Kenny could even ask a follow-up question, Raviv, the brother, just suddenly started yelling, get out, we don't want you here," at somebody across the yard. And so Kenny turned to see who Raviv was yelling at, and he saw this teenage boy standing there, looking completely shocked and scared. And at this point, Raviv went from yelling at Hassan to yelling at Kenny to arrest Hassan, because that was the man who killed Eliza. Late on the night of August 10th, 2005, so just a few hours after the body of 18-year-old Eliza Parsi was found dead in her home in Staten Island, NYPD detective Michael Kenny sat inside of an interrogation room at his precinct. Across from him was Eliza's ex-boyfriend, Hassan, who had been detained after he showed up at the crime scene. So far, Hassan had been very cooperative and had shared a very detailed timeline of his whereabouts that day. However, he did not have a solid alibi for that afternoon and the early evening, which was likely when Eliza was killed. Kenny had taken a DNA sample from Hassan, and he also had gotten samples from Eliza's mother and brother at the scene to compare against the blood that had been found on that towel and any other DNA that was found on Eliza's body. But in 2005, DNA and blood evidence took weeks to process. So Kenny was really hoping to just get Hassan to confess right now. So once all his basic questions were out of the way, Kenny decided to test Hassan's truthfulness. And he asked Hassan if he had ever snuck into Eliza's house. But Hassan, he didn't deny it. He immediately came clean and admitted to everything. He said that yes, he had previously snuck into her house, and he did sit on Eliza's bed, and he had waited there until she woke up. That was all true. But Hassan insisted that he had not been trying to scare Eliza. He just desperately wanted to talk to her so they could hopefully get back together again. And Hassan had said that when he did that, Eliza hadn't been scared. She was just kind of annoyed, and she had told him that they were broken up for real. And after that, he said he had left without incident. Kenny noticed that in Hassan's version of the story, the way that Eliza reacted to Hassan sitting on her bed, just being kind of annoyed and exasperated about it, was very different than the way Eliza's mother, Seema, had described the same event. She had said that her daughter had basically been scared for her life. So he asked Hassan, why does Eliza's family dislike you so much? Why were they so quick to say you killed Eliza? And Hassan just kind of hung his head and said he didn't think it was about him personally. It was about religion. Hassan was Muslim, and the Parsis were Orthodox Jewish. As Kenny took this in, he wasn't sure which version of the story to believe. Were Hassan and Eliza star-crossed lovers kept apart by her family? Or was Hassan an obsessive ex-boyfriend who couldn't take no for an answer? But regardless, Kenny could not ignore the fact that Hassan had a strong motive and a history of sneaking into Eliza's house uninvited. But Kenny still didn't have a confession from Hassan, nor did he have really any hard evidence at all that would allow him to even hold Hassan. So ultimately, after the interview was over, he told Hassan he was free to go. The next day, Thursday, August 11th, Detective Kenny walked up to a Jewish Orthodox synagogue in Brooklyn, where Eliza's funeral was about to take place. The reason it was happening so quickly was because of the Jewish Orthodox custom that a body must be buried within 24 hours of death. And because of that timeline, it meant that Eliza's autopsy had already been completed. And Kenny had just received the report from the medical examiner, which confirmed that Eliza had died from asphyxiation, likely from being smothered by that pillow. The medical examiner had also found DNA evidence that could be tested against those samples Kenny had collected from the suspects. There were some skin cells under Eliza's fingernails, as well as semen that showed Eliza had sex before she died, probably within 24 hours. And so this evidence made Kenny think that Eliza had been sexually assaulted and had fought back against the person assaulting her, which would explain the skin under her nails. But when Kenny called the medical examiner to voice this theory that he now thought was pretty likely, the medical examiner had actually disagreed, because they didn't find any bruising or bleeding or anything else that indicated sexual violence. And so the autopsy actually concluded that the sex Eliza had before she was killed must have been consensual. But regardless, in Kenny's opinion, the facts of the case so far pointed towards a romantic partner being the killer, which obviously cleared Raviv and Seema and any other family members. And it also did not seem to be some random burglar or home intruder, because Seema had confirmed that nothing in the house was missing. Now, a few of the neighbors had mentioned that there had been some landscapers who had been working at the house next door at the time of her death, and Kenny had managed to track down the crew and question them. But they had all insisted that they had never left the neighbor's yard and that they hadn't seen or heard anything. But just to be sure, Kenny had taken their DNA samples just in case. Now, as Kenny made his way through the crowded sidewalk in front of the synagogue, he could see two distinct groups of people in attendance. There were members of the Orthodox community wearing their long skirts and prayer shawls, and also young people dressed in more modern clothes, who he assumed were Eliza's friends from school. Kenny walked up the front steps and entered the synagogue, and he noticed that the inside of the building was split in half by a wooden partition, almost like a wall, with men on one side and women on the other. So Kenny joined the men's side and stood in the back corner where he could just observe. Kenny noticed Eliza's brother, Raviv, standing near the front, near the casket, and he watched as other men walked up to pay him their respects. The atmosphere was solemn, understandably, and Kenny didn't pick up on any tension or animosity. It just sort of felt like a community coming together to kind of make sense of this tragedy. But then Kenny felt the energy in the room suddenly change, like a switch had flicked. And he could hear people start to whisper to each other very urgently, and everybody's heads turned to look back towards the entrance. Kenny turned his head and looked as well, and he saw this one person who was trying to push through the crowd and make their way up the aisle to the front, where Eliza's casket was. And Kenny realized this person was Hassan. For some reason, he'd shown up again, despite the fact that Eliza's family clearly didn't want him around. And Kenny actually watched as Raviv, who, had seen Hassan, Raviv went straight to Hassan and literally stopped him and shoved him backwards and shouted at him to get out because they all knew he killed Eliza. Kenny, sensing a physical fight was going to happen here, began pushing his way through the crowd to try to stop them and separate them. But fortunately, before he reached them, other men separated Hassan and Raviv, and then Hassan was escorted out of the building. About 2 weeks later, on August 24, 2005, Detective Kenny was in the office of the NYPD Computer Crime Unit, where the department's IT specialists had begun digging into Eliza's online life. After her funeral, Kenny had spoken to Eliza's school friends, who had told him that Eliza had been trying to move on from her relationship with Hassan, and that she had actually opened accounts on a whole bunch of dating sites that she used to meet guys or sometimes just hook up. And when Kenny had pressed them for more information, the friends had told him that none of those online men were from her tight-knit Orthodox community, which was part of the appeal to Eliza. But it obviously was not something she wanted to share with her mother, so she'd kept it all a big secret from everybody except from her closest friends. Kenny had been able to actually get Eliza's computer with her mother's permission and had brought some IT specialists on board who were able to dig into Eliza's email and browser history. Now, Kenny watched as the IT specialists directed his attention to one of Eliza's dating site message threads. In this thread, Eliza and a man named Jonathan were making plans for when and where they were going to meet up to have sex. They'd gone back and forth on a few different options until finally, Eliza just said that he should just come over to her house when her mother was at work, and that she would leave the back door unlocked so he could sneak in without the neighbors seeing. Kenny saw that this particular hookup was planned for Tuesday, August 9th, 2005, just one day before Eliza was killed. Now, naturally, this made Kenny and the rest of the investigators raise an eyebrow, because this plan of Eliza and Jonathan's, of having him enter secretly through the back door while Seema was at work, matched up exactly with what they had found at the crime scene. In late August of 2005, more than 2 weeks after the murder of Eliza Parsi, NYPD detective Michael Kenny was sitting at a kitchen table in an apartment in Brooklyn, New York, across from Jonathan Harris, the internet dating match who Eliza had secretly invited to her home the day before she was killed. When Kenny informed the young man that he was here investigating the murder of Eliza Parsi, he noticed that Jonathan didn't seem surprised. But Eliza's murder had been all over local news, and a lot of stories were really exploiting her romantic past and her sex life, so he had probably already heard about what had happened. Kenny asked Jonathan if he had known Eliza, and Jonathan said yes. Then he detailed basically everything that had been planned in that chat message. He said that he had gone to her house, he had snuck in through the back door that was unlocked, and they had had consensual sex. At least Jonathan swore it had been consensual. Jonathan insisted that after that, he had not seen Eliza again, and had never even gone back to Staten Island after that. He then gave Kenny a detailed timeline of where he had been on the day Eliza was killed, and overall, he was a lot more cooperative than Kenny had expected. He even provided a DNA sample without any objection. And so as Kenny left Jonathan's apartment, he was starting to feel a bit worried that this potential big break in the case might actually turn out to be a dead end. Weeks later, on September 13th, 2005, Detective Kenny sat at his desk, reviewing all the information he had gathered about Eliza Parsi's murder. He had checked Jonathan's phone records, also his transit card, and his toll pass, but there was nothing that put him on Staten Island the day of Eliza's murder. And the computer crimes investigators had not turned up any other promising suspects from Eliza's online dating profiles. Detective Kenny had also continued digging into Hassan, but he didn't have enough evidence to either arrest him or clear him. And this was frustrating because Eliza's murder had stayed in the news, and there was a lot of pressure to find the killer. especially from the Orthodox Jewish community, which was significant in New York. It was starting to look like the case had gone cold. But just then, Kenny's phone rang. And when he picked it up, it was the medical examiner who was calling with an update. The results of the DNA analysis were finally in, and the semen sample did not match those skin cells that had been found under Eliza's fingernails. So this meant there was DNA from 2 different people at the crime scene. And when the medical examiner said who each of these samples belonged to, suddenly Detective Kenny knew who killed Eliza. Based on the entire investigation, DNA evidence, and the killer's eventual confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eliza Parsi on the afternoon of August 10th, 2005. Shortly before 2 p.m., the killer approached the back door of the Parsi home where they knew they wouldn't be seen by neighbors. And once they were there, they slowly opened up the door. Once they were inside, they walked all the way through the house right to the front door just to check to make sure it was locked, which it was. And so after that, they went and got a heavy mirror and they moved it and put it in front of the door to block it. The killer knew that both women who lived in this house, Seema and her daughter Eliza, worked during the day. And so the killer didn't expect them to come home. But just in case, they didn't want to take any chances, hence barricading the door. Once they were satisfied with the barricade, the killer got to work, opening drawers and cabinets, looking in every place they could, because they needed something very specific inside of this home that was very valuable. But they couldn't find it anywhere on the bottom floor, which made the killer think it must be in one of the bedrooms upstairs. So the killer climbed the stairs and went into the master bedroom, where they looked through the dresser and in the closet, but they still couldn't find what they were looking for. So the killer left the master bedroom and decided to search the other bedroom next. But when they opened the door to that bedroom, they were shocked to see a young woman coming out of the attached bathroom wrapped in a towel. And from this young woman's reaction on her face, the killer could tell that she knew what they, the killer, were up to. And this enraged the killer because they were sure this woman was going to tell someone what she saw, and it would ruin the killer's plan. After a moment of just shocked silence between the two of them, the young woman opened her mouth like she was about to scream for help. And so the killer instinctively just tackled her to the ground and then grabbed a nearby pillow and pressed it down hard over her face. She scratched and she clawed, trying everything to break free, but the more she fought, the angrier and more emboldened the killer became, and the harder they pressed down, until eventually her body went limp. After that, the killer stood up and they looked down and they saw what they had done, and it caused them to start to panic, because they never meant to kill her, just to scare her and shut her up, but they had obviously gone too far. So, not knowing what to do, the killer just grabbed the pillow and put it over her face, and then also dragged the mattress and put it on top of her body, just so they wouldn't have to look at her. Then, instead of continuing their search for this thing that they wanted inside of this home, they just went downstairs and left out the back door. And they didn't return to the house for hours, not until they received a call from their mother, because the killer was Eliza's half-brother, Raviv. The DNA from the semen that was found at the crime scene belonged to Jonathan, the man that Eliza had consensually had sex with 24 hours before her death. The DNA that was found under Eliza's fingernails belonged to Raviv. It would turn out Eliza's death did not have anything to do with who she was sleeping with. Raviv was angry at their mother because the family business that she had passed along to him didn't make as much money as he had thought it would. And so as a result, Raviv was stuck working all these long hours and also raising his family in his in-laws' basement, which he found totally humiliating. And he knew that Seema had recently come into some money through the sale of a property in connection with her divorce. And Raviv felt like that money was rightfully his, because he had a wife and a child to provide for. But Seema wouldn't give it to him. So instead of driving his typical delivery route on Long Island that day, Raviv went to his mother's house to literally look for the money so he could steal it. But Eliza's work schedule had recently changed, and so he didn't realize Eliza's shift actually started later in the day. And so what was supposed to be a simple robbery turned deadly. Raviv ultimately pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. On the afternoon of Wednesday, April 12, 2006, Dr. John Yelnick finished up his final exam of the day at his dental practice in the rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He handed his patient a toothbrush and told her to come back in 6 months. Then he headed into his back office to pack up. Once he'd gathered up all his things, he walked out through the reception area and told the receptionist to have a great night. She waved and gave John a big smile. However, as soon as John actually left the building, the smile faded from his face, because in reality, he had a lot of problems right now, and pretending to be happy all day was actually really exhausting. And so John walked across the lot, climbed into his car, and then began the half-mile drive from his dental practice to his house. So John had actually grown up in Blairsville, and it had been his lifelong dream to raise a family here. So when he graduated from dental school 13 years earlier, he could have set up shop in a big city and very likely made a higher salary right off the bat. But instead, he joined the practice of his own childhood dentist right in downtown Blairsville. And it would actually turn out that John was able to make a lot of money right here in his hometown. This dental practice really took off, in part because John himself was really charming and great with kids, and so lots of families wanted to come here. And so what John had done is, with the extra money he was making, basically above and beyond what he expected, he took that extra money and invested it into real estate and became a millionaire by the time he was in his 30s. However, it was not until John met his wife, Michelle, that he really felt like he had made it in life. Michelle was a single mother with 2 children, and to John, this was actually perfect, because it meant that she came with a ready-made family. Now, John's friends were sort of worried that Michelle only wanted John for his money, but when John's mom got sick with cancer, Michelle took on the responsibility of being her full-time caregiver. And for John, that was all the proof that he ever needed that Michelle truly cared for him. And so the pair got married in 1997, and they actually adopted a little boy named JJ shortly after their marriage. And so altogether, they had 3 children. And together, this new big family moved into this big house with a pool and a hot tub. It was like everything was perfect. However, now, as John arrived back home and pulled into the driveway of his very modest home, and he sat there just staring at this new place he was currently living, he just thought to himself, like, how had everything fallen apart so completely? These days, John was very tight on money. He'd lent tens of thousands of dollars to a bunch of people because he was quite generous, but now he was having to ask for it back because he literally needed the money. And then on the marriage side, he and Michelle had hit this horrible rough patch that just didn't end, and they both admitted they had had affairs, and so now they were living separately, which was why John was here at this little house instead of coming home to the big family house with the pool and the hot tub. However, the financial stress and the marital stress, as bad as they were not nearly as bad as a third stressor in John's life. And that was that John was absolutely convinced that somebody was going to murder him. Now, this all started 2 weeks earlier when somebody vandalized John's car with spray paint. And the police looked into it, but they couldn't figure out who had done it. And, objectively, having your car spray painted, vandalized in some way does not, therefore mean someone's trying to kill you. But he just had this feeling that this felt really personal, like somebody was targeting him. And so eventually, over several days, John went from "my car got vandalized" to "my car got vandalized, and it makes me feel like someone's trying to kill me." And John believed this so completely that he actually went to his attorney and gave her $10,000 just in case he wound up dead. She could use that to investigate his murder. Now, John got out of his car, and he walked up his porch steps and into his home, and he closed the door and locked it behind him. And right away, John just felt like this house, it's already so depressing, but it was so quiet because nobody was here. I mean, he wished his adopted son JJ was here because he would have made the whole house just feel alive. But, these days, John didn't see JJ very much. He would go long stretches between visits. John took off his shoes and walked into the living room, and there on the coffee table, he saw a legal document that he had been avoiding. That document was a stack of divorce papers. Michelle had actually filed for divorce 3 years earlier, in 2003, but she and John had not been able to actually come to an agreement. Now, to be clear, they were not fighting to save the marriage. Like, the marriage was done. Michelle was actually already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. However, what John and Michelle had been fighting over, which had caused this divorce to drag on, was JJ, their adopted son. Michelle wanted full custody, but John didn't want to give up his son. However, John knew in less than 24 hours, this would all finally be over. Their lawyers had finally settled on a shared custody agreement, and Michelle had already signed the paperwork, and tomorrow it would be John's turn to sign. And so John took a seat on the couch and turned on the TV. But he couldn't even focus, he was just too restless. So instead, he called his aunt, who he was very close to, and he talked with her for a while about the divorce and about the custody agreement. And then eventually, when they said their goodbyes, John hung up, he stretched out on the couch, and he fell asleep right there. The next day, around 3:30 p.m., a 9-year-old boy named Zach Hughes, who lived next door to John, walked out the front door of his parents' house and across the lawn towards John's house. Zach wanted to see if John's son, JJ, could come out and play. He wasn't sure if JJ would actually be around, since JJ did split time between his mother and his father's place, but, he figured it was worth a shot. But when Zach reached the front steps to John and JJ's house, he stopped, because he saw there was this little glass panel to the left of the front door that had been broken, shattered. There was glass on the porch. And also, Zach could see streaks of what looked like red liquid that had dried underneath the broken panel. Immediately, Zach got scared. He sees this and thinks it's blood. He wants to turn and run away. But he thought about his friend JJ, and he was worried that maybe he was in some kind of trouble, so he couldn't just abandon him. And so, sort of mustering all the courage he could, Zach slowly and very nervously climbed the rest of the steps to the front door, and he tried the doorknob, but he found the door was locked. And so as carefully as he could, Zach actually reached his hand through that broken panel to the left of the door, being careful not to cut himself, and he reached inside the house and unlocked the door from the inside, and then he opened it up. And as soon as he stepped into the house, he saw there were papers strewn everywhere, and there was a body laying motionless on the floor, covered in blood. At that point, Zach turned around and he ran. About 15 minutes later, Corporal Janelle Leidick of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was driving with her husband and 4 children when she got a call from dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally very quiet residential street, but the details were still a bit confusing. Dispatch just said there had been a cardiac arrest and that Corporal Leidick was needed at the scene. There was no other information available. So, thinking the call was sort of a run-of-the-mill heart attack, Leidick, with her family, just drove straight over there. However, when she actually pulled up to the home and got out of her vehicle, she could tell that this was not a heart attack. She saw there was a patrol officer waiting for her on the porch, and his face looked grim. Leidick walked over to him, and he immediately pointed out that broken glass and the blood that, appeared to be stained to the ground. And so she asked him, what's going on here? I was told this was a cardiac arrest. And all he said was, it's probably best if you just go in and look for yourself. So Leidick, she turned and waved to her husband and kids, sort of signaling everything's fine, just give me a minute. And then she stepped inside the house. And right away, she was sort of struck by what she saw. The whole foyer was splashed with blood all over the floor and the walls. And there, in the center of it, amongst, all these papers strewn about, was the most mutilated body she had ever seen. Now, Leidick had never actually worked a homicide before, but she knew, as she tried and failed to count the number of stab wounds on this man's body, that what she was looking at here was definitely not cardiac arrest. This was her very first murder case. She also knew she needed backup because, this call had been recorded erroneously as a cardiac arrest, but what that meant is the police had not sent a full emergency response. And so Leidick and this other patrol officer were the only people on scene. Leidick was afraid the killer or killers could still be in the area, or maybe even in this house. They hadn't even secured the house yet. And she's thinking she brought her kids and her husband with her. So she immediately instructed the patrol officer to search the rest of the house, and then she went back out into the front yard to basically stand guard between the murder scene and her family with her hand on the gun in her holster. Luckily, though, it wasn't long before Leidick heard a bunch of emergency sirens approaching in the distance. Also, at the same time, that patrol officer came out of the house to tell Leidick that it was empty. So the killer or killers were gone. The only new discovery this officer had made was he had found a huge puddle of blood in the basement where the victim had bled through from the floor above. And so at this point, Leidick said bye to her husband and her kids, and she sent them home. And then she went back into detective mode and went back inside the house. It was around this point that somebody on scene told Leidick what the victim's name was. They said his name was John Yelnick. And so as the crime scene technicians began their work processing the physical evidence inside the house, Leidick began a slow walk through each of the rooms inside the home, trying to get a sense of who John was, and also how he died. John's body was close to the front door, but it was clear that the attack that preceded his death had been very long and chaotic. There was blood all over the living room floor, which was also strewn with divorce papers. John's body was also found barefoot. However, there were bloody shoe prints in the house, and these prints were far too big to belong to that little boy who found the body, Zach. So Leidick figured they must belong to the killer or killers. And so the crime scene techs were already measuring the prints to try to determine the killer's shoe size. As Leidick continued walking through the house, she didn't see anything that at least overtly looked like it could have been used as a murder weapon. She also didn't see any evidence of a robbery. The TV hadn't been taken, no drawers or cabinets appeared to have been opened, and so on. And to Leidick, this actually made sense. I mean, the murder appeared to be extremely violent and so very likely quite personal, which suggested that whoever the killer was, or killers, the only thing they had really wanted when they entered this home was, apparently, for John to die horribly. She finished her sweep of the scene, ending up in the living room where it looked to her like the attack had begun. And that's when she noticed a check on the coffee table, right next to some of the divorce papers. The check was made out to the victim, John Yelnick, for $15,000. And attached to the check was a note asking John to hold off for a few days before he deposited it. The check and note were from somebody named Melissa Use. And when Leidick saw that, she did a double take. Use was the last name of the neighborhood boy, Zach, who had discovered John's body. And so Leidick wondered if Melissa Use was related to Zach Use, the boy. And so now Corporal Leidick realized that here on the coffee table, she had her first two legitimate leads. One, her victim was in the middle of a divorce. And someone, maybe his next door neighbor if Melissa was connected to Zach, owed him a lot of money that apparently she couldn't quite afford to pay back in one go, that she had to tell John to don't cash this right away. It was evening by the time Leidick finally stepped back outside the house, and when she did, she saw there was a group of neighbors and reporters jostling around each other out on the street. So Blairsville almost never had murders, and so Leidick knew this was obviously going to be a huge story. But for now, as much as she knew she was going to get hounded by reporters as she passed by them, she just needed to keep on walking because she had to get back to the station to get organized for interviews tomorrow, like with suspects. However, before she could even walk down the front steps, one of the other officers on scene came over to her with an update. Over the last few hours, the police had fanned out across the neighborhood to speak to people to see if anybody had seen or heard anything unusual. And the police had come back with two very interesting accounts. The first came from a woman who said that the previous night, around 1:30 in the morning, so technically early that same morning, she had woken up to the sound of a scream. And so she sat up, she heard the scream, but she said the screaming didn't continue, and so she had ultimately just gone back to bed. The second account came from another neighbor who had also heard something around that same time the previous night. This neighbor said they heard a man yelling in what sounded like a very heated argument. Now, the neighbor couldn't make out everything the man was saying, but there was one sentence that was yelled very clearly, and that was, "I'll never loan you money again." And so instantly, when Leidick heard that, she thought of the $15,000 check on the coffee table. Like, this seems to add more credibility to the idea that maybe money was behind this. However, the officer said he wasn't done. He said he had one more important piece of information for Leidick. In addition to the witness statements, a lot of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one family in particular on the block that detectives really ought to look into. And that was the Use family. Because word around the neighborhood was that Melissa Use and John Yelnick had been having an affair. The following day, April 14th, Leidick was at the police station, sitting at a table inside of an interrogation room across from Melissa Use and her husband Tom. Now again, Leidick had never done a murder case before, but she was a very methodical investigator, and she had a plan for interrogating her persons of interest. First, she was going to go very hard at Melissa and Tom Use, even though they were not her top suspects. At this point, her top suspects were John's soon-to-be ex-wife Michelle and her new boyfriend Kevin, for the simple reason that in a murder case, from what she'd been told, the divorcing spouse and their new partner are always suspects number 1 and 2. The night before, Leidig had sent an officer to tell Michelle that her soon-to-be ex-husband was dead. But when the officer got to Michelle's house, she already knew, although she said that she had heard that John had died of a heart attack. So this officer had to break the news to Michelle and also her new boyfriend Kevin that this was actually a murder, and they both seemed genuinely shocked. Corporal Leidig actually knew Michelle's boyfriend Kevin personally because he was a state police trooper. They had actually worked together. But now, Leidig was going to have to investigate her colleague Kevin, because he's one of the suspects, which was obviously very touchy, especially amongst cops. And so what Leidig wanted to do was gather more information, before she spoke to Michelle and Kevin. First, what she wanted to do was rule the Uses out as suspects, and she wanted to also get the results of the autopsy, which was scheduled to take place later that day. So now, Leidig looked across the interrogation table at John's neighbors, Melissa and Tom Use. And Leidig began by asking them what the deal was with that $15,000 check Melissa had written to John that was found near his body. Melissa answered in a very shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been friends since about 9th grade, and she was planning to open a new bakery in town. And John had just loaned her $15,000 to help her out with that. But then sort of out of nowhere, he'd asked for the money back. Melissa said she'd been really disappointed when he did this, but she also knew John was in the middle of a very expensive divorce, so she understood. She said that she had only had $14,000 in her account when she wrote the check, and so that's why she had also left that note for John along with the check, asking him not to cash it for a few days until she got that last $1,000 together. Leidig watched Melissa closely as she said all this. She did seem truly distraught over John's death, and that the money really didn't seem like a big issue to her at all, relative to John's death. But for Leidig, the obvious warmth that Melissa clearly felt for John raised another, more sensitive question here, and she decided that she really just couldn't dance around it, even though Melissa was literally sitting next to her husband, Tom. Leidig looked right at Melissa and asked her straight out, was she having an affair with John? Melissa immediately flushed and said no, and she said they'd been close friends, but really nothing more. At this point, Leidig turned to Melissa's husband, Tom, and just asked him the same thing. Was his wife having an affair with John? And for a second, Tom just went quiet, but then when he finally spoke, he didn't sound angry or upset. He just seemed really nervous. And he basically refused to answer the question. And instead, he just kept repeating that he really had to go take care of his kids now. Now, Leidig knew this had been a very blunt thing to ask, but Tom's reaction to this question was really suspicious. And so by the time Leidig told Melissa and Tom that they could go, Tom had firmly established himself in Leidig's mind as a clear person of interest. Before Leidig left the station for the day, she checked in with one of her officers who she had sent to go observe John's autopsy. The officer told her that the forensic pathologist had determined that the killer used a one-sided blade to repeatedly slash John during the fight. In addition to the knife wounds, John's jugular had been cut by glass. And John also had defensive wounds on his hands, as well as cuts on his back, which suggested he had at one point tried to run away. I mean, Leidig already knew this, but to hear the details from the autopsy just reinforced how truly brutal this murder was. And so what Leidig thought after hearing these details was, wow, whoever did this must have truly hated John. And Leidig's already thinking, I already have one suspect in Tom Use whose wife might have been having an affair with John. Certainly that would be enough to inspire Tom to hate John. Despite Leidig's, obvious inexperience with murder cases, she felt really confident at this point that she'd be able to solve this, as long as she was allowed to work slowly and methodically, like she always had on every case she had worked in. However, the case was already getting a lot of attention in the news, and so Leidig knew there would be pressure to show results fast. If she moved too slowly, this case might either get taken away from her, or another police agency might get called in to help to speed it up. Now, Leidig didn't want that to happen, but she also really didn't want to compromise her methodical investigative process either, and so she figured she would have to strike a balance. That officer who had gone to the autopsy had come back with John Yelnick's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and tissue samples, which Leidick was supposed to send off to a state police lab for DNA testing. But Leidick decided, now that she had these samples, that she was not going to do that. Leidick really wanted to keep her investigatory options open and to guarantee that she knew every single thing going on with her evidence in this case. And so after Leidick got these samples and after this officer had left, she went to the department refrigerator and put them in there, and then she went home. The next day was April 15th, so 2 days after John Yelnick was murdered. By this point, Corporal Leidick had spoken to a number of John's friends and family members, and they'd painted John generally as a great guy and a very dedicated father. Today, Leidick was going to John's dental practice to talk to his colleagues to see if they had anything different to say. And as soon as Leidick arrived at John's office, she was glad she had decided to go there, because the dental hygienist and the receptionist had a lot to say about John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle Yelnick. And this was because during that long, multi-year fight John and Melissa had over their divorce, Michelle had at one point lodged allegations against John that he abused their adopted son, JJ. Even Michelle's own family had not believed her, and officials had declined to press charges. But at one point during the back and forth, Michelle had accused John of violating a stay-away order, and police had come and arrested him at work. And so John's colleagues thought Michelle was a total nightmare. She also called the office regularly to demand money, and John often caved and gave it to her. But actually, according to one of the hygienists, Michelle had called just a few days before the murder, and that time, John had actually refused to speak to her. And this detail definitely caught Leidick's ear. It was not just the, colleagues at the dental practice that said Michelle was money hungry. A lot of John's friends said that. They said it was Michelle who wanted the big house with the pool and the hot tub. But John really had never felt comfortable with that, flashy lifestyle. And to many of John's friends and colleagues, it was that contrast between he and Michelle that ultimately sort of drove them apart. And so Leidick began to wonder, maybe John and Michelle had a fight about money a few days before his murder, where Michelle's calling, trying to demand money. John's not taking her call. Could that have been enough to inspire Michelle to murder John? Maybe. But also what Leidick discovered is that Michelle was actually listed as a beneficiary of John's life insurance plan. And so if John died, she stood to inherit literally millions of dollars. And so now there's like a twofold financial reason for Michelle to want to bring harm to John, basically all because of money. But it didn't seem possible that Michelle would be capable of overpowering John and delivering all those stab wounds and killing him. It just seemed like John would be able to fight her off if she was the killer. But Leidick thought, maybe Michelle hired somebody else to do it, somebody else that was much larger and more physical. She certainly had the money to do that. And so as Leidick left the dental office, she began to think about how she was actually going to approach Michelle. Given the sensitivity of the fact that Michelle was dating a cop, Leidick did not want to make her move too soon without enough ammunition first. This was not just the first murder case she had worked. This was, the first murder case and the biggest case, period, that she had ever worked. Reporters were calling her constantly. This was a really big deal, and she didn't want to screw anything up. John Yelnick's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, so 6 days after the murder. And Corporal Leidick knew that his friends and family were already beginning to get pretty antsy about why the investigation seemed to be moving so slowly. But, Leidick did understand where they were coming from. From day one, there was an enormous amount of media pressure, just very public pressure to solve this thing right away. And so that was weighing on friends and family. And also, John himself, before he was killed, had this paranoia that he was going to be murdered. And now he's turned up dead. It just seemed like a crazy coincidence, or that John knew something, that this really was a prediction that came true. But Leidick also felt like John's friends and family just didn't understand why this was taking the time it was taking. She wasn't just being slow. She was being careful. That was her way. Without any real departmental guidance on how to actually work a homicide, Leidick had developed a very, careful method of her own. And for the next several months, Lydic continued to follow her protocol, and she did take her time, but again, with intention. The crime scene unit had not turned up any matchable DNA or fingerprints at the crime scene, and the bloody footprints they found didn't belong to any of Lydic's suspects. And so for now, Lydic was really relying heavily on interviews. And Lydic, she would run down every single tip and rumor that she could find, systematically ruling things out one by one. And as she did this, she always kept tabs on her three best suspects, Tom Use, Kevin Foley, and Michelle Yelnick. But she made no move to arrest any of them. Sometimes the complaints from the public and from John Yelnick's own family about, her failure to solve this case more quickly did get to her, but she was determined to manage the case her way. She felt like she was on the right path. That was until Melissa Use, so John's alleged affair partner and next-door neighbor, hired a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2006, so about 3 months after the murder, when Lydic got a call from Melissa. Lydic had actually been pretty surprised to hear from her, and then even more surprised when Melissa told her she wanted to meet at John's house. And then when Lydic showed up, Melissa was there, but she wasn't alone. She was standing on the sidewalk with these two older women who she introduced as psychic sisters. She said that she had met them at a psychic tea party, and they had visions about the case. And Lydic was really not happy about this. And she was even less happy to learn that John's own family had given permission for the psychics to enter John's house. But Lydic also knew that John's family was getting really edgy, and if she wanted more time to work on her case, she needed to placate them. If that meant working with these psychics contacted by one of the suspects' wives, then that was what Lydic was going to do. And so Lydic followed Melissa and the psychic sisters as they walked into John's front yard and began saying they felt hot and cold patches, and, Lydic is doing her best not to roll her eyes. And then when they went into the house, which had not been cleaned out after the murder and so was still splattered with blood, the psychic sisters had a premonition that told them the killing had happened in the dining room area. And then the psychic said they saw a knife and they saw stab wounds and a bloody footprint, and they said the killer drove a black or red car, and that the killer was not Melissa Use's husband, Tom. Now, Melissa, as she listened to the psychic speak, she seemed really excited by this, but Lydic thought it was all ridiculous. The blood that they were literally looking at inside the home made it pretty obvious where the killing had happened. And the details of John's death and the huge police investigation that followed had been all over the news. And so the things the psychics were saying were easy to learn before showing up here. These are not revelations. And the fact that these psychics, who Melissa herself had brought here and hired, were now exonerating Melissa's husband was not very convincing. And so as the group finally left the house, the only thing Lydic thought these psychics had been good for was taking some of the pressure off her slow but steady investigation. She knew that at this point, John Yelnick's family had lost faith in her. But what they didn't know is she still had one more thing she wanted to try. She just had to wait for the right time to use it. Fast forward to February of 2007, so 10 months after the murder. And at this point, Corporal Lydic finally got her chance. John's cousins made an impassioned plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office to take over the investigation. Lydic's cooperation with those psychics had bought her a little time, but ultimately both John's family and Melissa Use had gotten more and more agitated by Lydic's very slow pace. They felt like the psychics had basically given them as much information as the police had, and the Attorney General ultimately agreed, which meant Lydic was losing her case. And on the one hand, this was quite literally the exact thing that Lydic had been most worried about, that some bigger agency would come in and take over her investigation. But on the other hand, the Attorney General's office was not the agency that Lydic had expected. And so now, even though this definitely stung, Lydic realized that she could actually finally make that play she'd been sitting on for almost a year. And so Lydic went to that refrigerator in the Blairsville police station and took out that little container of fingernail clippings and other tissue samples from John Yelnick that her officer had brought to her after John's autopsy. She had been told she needed to send these samples off to the state police crime lab pretty much right away, but she hadn't. In a total breach of protocol, Leidig had decided to not do that and instead put these samples in the fridge and wait. But now, with the Attorney General very publicly stepping in and getting involved in this case, it sort of made the case way more high profile, which in turn allowed Leidig to send these samples not to the state police crime lab, but to the FBI crime lab, a higher rung on the hierarchy. Now, normally the FBI would never take samples from sort of a small town murder case, but now that it was this huge public case, national news, Leidig knew she could take advantage. So she repackaged those fingernail clippings and the other samples, and she sent them off to the FBI, and she waited. The day the results came back in, Leidig was very nervous. There was a chance that she was about to look very stupid for sitting on this evidence for as long as she had. But as she sat at her computer and opened the email with the DNA results, her eyes went wide. She almost couldn't believe what she was reading, because her strategy of intentionally slow playing this investigation and sitting on this evidence until right now had totally paid off. Finally, Leidig on her computer was looking at the name of John's killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and tested by the FBI, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to John Yelnick in the early morning hours of April 13th, 2006. Around 12:30 a.m., the killer drove their red car onto a quiet residential street in Blairsville. They eventually came to a stop in front of a modest brick home. There, they cut their lights. The killer climbed out and looked around the neighborhood to make sure no one was watching, but it was dark and silent. So, the killer left the street and walked around to the back of this home and then slipped inside of it through an unlocked back door. Once inside, the killer walked through the dining room and then into the living room where they found John Yelnick sleeping on the couch. The killer gripped a single-edged knife in their fist, and they walked right up to John, and they raised the blade up and then brought it down directly onto John. Instantly, John woke up and began screaming, and he put his hands up to try to protect himself, and he even tried clawing at the killer, getting the killer's skin under his fingernails. And so John eventually rolled off the couch, desperate to get away. John eventually got up and sort of began to stumble away, but the killer chased him down, and the two began to wrestle. And as they're struggling and the killer is stabbing John, John's flailing his arms around, and he eventually hit the divorce papers on the coffee table, throwing them everywhere. And then eventually, somehow, just on pure adrenaline, John broke away from the killer and tried to run for the front door. John eventually did make it to the front foyer, and he actually reached for the front door, but the killer actually shoved John as he did that, and John went flying towards that pane of glass to the side of the door, and his head went through the glass, and when his head went through, some of the glass severed his jugular, and then John bled to death right there. The killer watched until John was totally still. At that point, they walked back out of the home, tracking John's blood right back out the door. The killer was very confident they would never be caught, primarily because the killer knew people trusted them with their lives. The killer was Michelle's new boyfriend, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley. And the fact that he was a cop was the very reason Corporal Leidig had decided not to send all of that evidence to the state police crime lab. Leidig knew Kevin, and she liked him, and she basically trusted him. But as soon as her investigation began, she began to hear about how much Kevin seemed to hate John, in part because of the allegations that Michelle had made that John had abused JJ. Even though those allegations were ruled totally unfounded, it seemed that Kevin ultimately believed them. And so Leidig had become increasingly paranoid that Kevin was the killer, and that her case would be taken over not by the Attorney General's office, but by the state police. And she was afraid that if Kevin was guilty here, well, she couldn't really trust the state police crime lab to not potentially cover up evidence. Or maybe Kevin would get involved, find out, and he would cover it up. It just was too risky. And so she didn't want to send the evidence to the state crime lab. So Leidig had done something really risky. To keep complete control over her investigation, she'd kept the fingernails and all the tissue samples that were collected at the autopsy, even though she knew they very likely contained the DNA of John's killer. Then she slow-played her investigation, biding her time until she could figure out what to do with those samples. And luckily, the answer came about a year later when the Attorney General took over the case, and Leidig then got access to the FBI crime lab. The FBI scientists did finally test the DNA that was found under the fingernails and found that it was a match for Kevin Foley. And so in the end, State Trooper Kevin Foley was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Michelle Yelnick, she was never actually charged in connection with the case. On the morning of November 18, 2019, 54-year-old detective Muzi Mkhize stood in a long line waiting to get into a courthouse in Ikapa, South Africa. So Muzi was an investigator on a very violent robbery case that was finally being tried today, even though the robbery itself had happened almost 6 years earlier. Back in 2014, a group of armed men had stormed into a couple's farmhouse in Ikapa and brutally beat the couple before making off with a bunch of electronics and jewelry and weapons and other valuables. And so Muzi and his team had eventually caught and arrested these criminals, and in fact, they were even able to recover some of the items that had been stolen. In fact, now, Muzi had one of those stolen items with him to present as evidence at today's trial. Muzi had done this kind of court duty plenty of times in his career, but today, he felt really drained. On top of his trial prep for, this case, he'd also been working other active cases and also mentoring junior detectives. And Muzi was not young and energetic anymore. He was nearing retirement age, and all these obligations were really starting to take a toll on him. But the biggest thing that was really exhausting Muzi was this robbery case itself. It had been an extremely long process, full of an unusual number of delays and complications. It had actually taken so long to bring this to trial that the evidence Muzi was holding, like literally right now, had actually been returned to the victim couple so they could use it until the trial finally happened. So getting this case to this point had been extremely tiring, but Muzi and his team were determined to see it through no matter what. Because the criminals that did this, they were incredibly violent and genuinely needed to be behind bars to protect the public. They'd severely beaten this couple to the point where they were hospitalized, and it was lucky they hadn't been killed. As Muzi entered the courthouse and passed through the court security checkpoint, he hoped the security guards were appropriately on alert. In his experience, violent offenders, like the ones who were on trial today, often had violent friends, especially in Ikapa, where this kind of crime was unfortunately rampant. It wasn't unheard of for criminals or gang members to barge into court proceedings and retaliate against cops or prosecution. But Muzi was able to get through security. There was no suspicious people or any sort of disruptions of any kind. And so Muzi, once through, made his way into the courtroom. And he saw the space was already full. The defense and the jury and prosecutors and judge were all there, and there were members of the public in the gallery. Muzi went over and sat down at the prosecution table, and he would remain there until it was his turn to go up to the judge and present, which would include, showing this evidence. As Muzi got settled into his seat and, put the evidence down in his lap, he turned and sort of gave a quick wave to the prosecutor, a woman named Adelaide Ferreira-Watt, who was sitting at the table as well. She was going over her trial notes. Muzi had worked with Adelaide before, and they got along really well together. And she was a total pro, at least in Muzi's mind. So he knew that, her being on board meant this case had a really good chance of getting a conviction. Adelaide waved back at Muzi and then quickly got back to her notes. And Muzi took a look around the courtroom and everything seemed quiet and, again, there was no sign of any gang members or criminal friends charging in to cause problems. And, Muzi just hoped it would stay this way and that the trial would go smoothly and end the way he hoped it would. A few minutes later, and the judge sort of called the court to order and got the trial started, at which point Adelaide got up and began to present the case. And at this moment, despite the fact that Muzi had waited almost 6 years to get to this point, at this moment, when it finally was happening, he just felt this enormous wave of exhaustion sweep over him. He wasn't energized, it was sort of the opposite. It was like relief. And also, the room they were in was pretty hot, and, he was pretty tired, and before long, his eyelids got heavier, and eventually his head kind of slumped over to the side, and he dozed off. And at first, everything was fine. For a couple of minutes, Muzi just slept in the courtroom, and nobody even noticed or cared. Everything was okay. But then at some point, there was this sudden, very loud scraping sound. It was the sound of a bunch of chairs in the courtroom moving across the ground, and it was just very loud, and it woke Muzi up, but like really abruptly. He was startled by the sound, and when he woke up, like in his, sudden jolting awake, he dropped the evidence that he was supposed to be in charge of onto the ground. And so he's getting up, he's getting his bearings, realizing that it's kind of embarrassing. He was asleep. Did anybody see him? Like, what's going on? Everyone's moving around. He sees the evidence on the ground. So he goes under the table, he scoops the evidence back up. And as he's sitting back up, he hears this loud, like deafening bang echo through the courtroom. And he still really doesn't know what's going on. I mean, he just woke up. It's sort of chaotic in the room. And then he hears the scream coming from the side, sort of over to his right. And he turns and he realizes the scream came from the prosecutor, Adelaide. And so Muzi looks over the table and he sees Adelaide laying on the ground and she's clutching her hip. And her hip is now gushing blood. And so obviously she's been attacked. That loud banging sound he heard was almost certainly a gunshot or an explosion of some kind. And so Muzi immediately is thinking, clearly the friends or affiliates of these criminals on trial have stormed the courthouse and they've attacked us. They've attacked Adelaide. Are there more shooters here? Are there more attackers in the building? And so Muzi, who again, he's only woken up like 30 seconds ago, he's still sort of confused. He begins looking around the courthouse for, perpetrators, someone who's attacking, a gunman or something. But all he sees is just the chaos of people trying to flee the courthouse and others rushing up to Adelaide to try to render care. Like, there were no perpetrators. There were no gunmen. There was nothing. It was just chaos. And so for a second, Muzi is just sitting there, not really even sure what to do, almost like paralyzed by shock. And also, again, he's just woken up. He's sort of getting his bearings. And then he thinks of something. He's looking around the courthouse, this crazy scene. And he realizes that there is no gunman. There's no perpetrator. There's nobody. There's nothing. Which can only mean one thing. So to understand what happened inside of that courtroom, you first have to understand something about South African police procedure. And that is that in South Africa, as in most countries, after evidence is taken from the scene of a crime, it's examined and determined to be safe and then transferred to an exhibit room until it's time for trial. However, unlike in other parts of the world, in South Africa, there are exceptions to this procedure. And this trial had taken almost 6 years to start. And because of that huge time lag, some of the evidence that was recovered from the robbers' homes had actually been returned to the victim couple it was taken from, so they could just use it until the trial finally happened. The couple had returned that particular evidence to the police that morning, and Muzi had been charged with bringing that evidence to court and literally holding that evidence. But Muzi, when he did this, didn't double check to make sure this evidence was safe to be in a courtroom. And sometime after Muzi fell asleep in the courtroom, the judge had announced that it was time to take a break. And so the scraping of chairs that woke him up was the sound of people getting up to leave. But for Muzi, it startled him and he sat up really suddenly, what's going on? And he dropped this evidence onto the ground. And it would turn out this was like the worst thing that could have possibly happened. Because this particular evidence was a shotgun. And when Muzi, sort of in his panicked, instinctive state, when he first woke up and he saw the evidence on the ground, he reached down to grab it, to pick it back up, because he was supposed to hold this thing for the whole trial and present it. The last thing he needed is people to see that he had fallen asleep and dropped it on the ground. But when he scooped it up, the gun, again, because it had not been re-examined, it would turn out it was still loaded. And so as he scooped it up, he accidentally hit the trigger and fired it, and it hit Adelaide, severed an artery, and killed her. But Muzi, was so confused by the chaos of the scene that at first, he didn't even realize he had fired the gun. He just scooped up the gun, heard the bang, and he's like, what's going on here? And it was when he realized there was no gunman that he looked down and he realized the shotgun was aimed right at Adelaide. He must have shot her. Muzi ultimately pled guilty to culpable homicide and negligence, and he was ordered to serve a 6-year prison sentence. However, it was suspended. Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the West Coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you got to act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballinstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballinstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all-expenses-paid-for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/Mr. Ballin. That is fandiem.com/Mr. Ballin. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. On the morning of July 14th, 1912, a 21-year-old athlete named Francisco Lazaro stood in his hotel room in Stockholm, Sweden, getting dressed and ready for the day. And he was in Sweden to run the marathon in the Olympics. So a marathon is a race that covers exactly 26.2 miles. And for elite runners, it usually takes them between 2 and 3 hours to finish. Lazaro was representing Portugal. And this was actually a really big deal. This was his home country's very first Olympics, which meant Lazaro was one of only a few Portuguese athletes at the Games. And Lazaro believed that out of all of those people, all those other Portuguese athletes, he actually stood the best chance at bringing home an actual medal. So Lazaro had a chance to do something really historic for his country. And realistically, he wasn't even that nervous because he knew he was a truly elite, incredible runner. Even though he was just 21 years old, Lazaro had already won 3 huge marathons in Portugal. So he was already a star back home. But he knew that if he wanted to win on the world stage, he would need to come extremely prepared. So that's exactly what he'd done. He'd trained for months, obviously. He'd also recently gotten a medical exam to confirm that he was very healthy. And he'd even begun thinking about, little ways that he could potentially give himself a boost, like how to fuel, what to put in his body and even what to put on his body. I mean, even the smallest detail, like a shirt that wasn't breathable or eating something that kind of sat heavily in his stomach could make the difference between winning or losing. Because again, this is like the world's best runners. Any little edge, he was going to take it. So now, Lazaro spent the next hour putting on the very specific clothes that he had selected for this race, and also eating a perfectly balanced light meal containing carbohydrates and protein, basically exactly what he had mapped out to help him in this race. He'd been warned that it was supposed to be very, very hot today on race day. But Lazaro actually saw this as an advantage, because being from Portugal, where it often got much hotter than places like Sweden, Lazaro already knew how to protect himself from the sun and the heat, and how to give himself an edge in this weather. And then before he knew it, Lazaro was ready to go, and he had left his hotel room, and he was on his way to the stadium to actually compete in the Olympics. A few hours later, around 1:45 p.m., Lazaro walked out into the middle of Stockholm's massive stadium where the race was going to start. And as race officials directed him and his 67 other competitors to their places at the starting line, Lazaro was feeling really confident. In fact, so confident that he called out to a nearby reporter that he was going to be the winner, saying, quote, "I win or I die." Now, as Lazaro and the others actually took their spots on the starting line, they were in the direct sunlight, and it was just unbelievably hot. I mean, in the shade, it was already 90 degrees, so it was like a sweltering day. But as Lazaro looked up and down the line of the other competitors, he saw everybody else look flushed and they were sweating profusely. They looked not ready to go run 26.2 miles in this heat. They looked overwhelmed. But Lazaro, he was not overwhelmed. He was prepared. In fact, Lazaro wasn't even sweating. As Lazaro stood there waiting for this race to start, he could hear the roar of the thousands of people in the stands. And for a moment, he just stood there taking it all in and just, appreciating how special this moment really was. The marathon was a major event in these Olympics. The stadium was completely sold out, and even the king and queen of Stockholm were supposed to be somewhere in the crowd watching this. And as Lazaro stood there having this moment, sort of taking it all in, he also had this certainty that when this race was finished, all those people in the stadium and around the world, even royalty, would know his name. Just then, he heard the announcer tell the runners to take their marks. And Lazaro felt a surge of adrenaline rush through him. A big hush fell over the crowd, and Lazaro and the rest of the racers stopped moving and just tensed, waiting for the signal. A couple of seconds went by, and then, bang, the starting gun went off, and Lazaro and everybody else lunged forward. And there was a bit of jostling as all the competitors surged off the line, and Lazaro was pushed back towards the middle of the pack. And right off the bat, Lazaro was a little surprised by how quick the overall pace was. But Lazaro still wasn't worried. He'd studied this course extensively, and he knew that he'd have a chance to get out in front of his competitors pretty soon. This marathon route was very flat, but Lazaro was used to competing in Portugal, which had much more mountainous terrain. So he was sure that once the other runners invariably started to get tired, especially from this hot weather, he'd still be feeling fine, and he could move out in front. So Lazaro just decided to hang back and wait to make his move as they moved out of the stadium and onto the dirt road beyond. And for the next hour and a half, he stuck to his plan and just kept his pace steady in the back. He knew, at some point, people would begin falling off as the heat wore down on them and they got tired, and he'd be able to make his way up, so he wasn't rushing. He was just waiting, biding his time, staying confident. In fact, as he was sort of keeping his pace in the back, he even was able to give another soundbite to one of the reporters that was on the road, telling her that he was feeling great. For the first half of this marathon, Lazaro really felt like he was running the race of his life. It was like everything in his training and in his background had prepared him to excel here on the world stage. He was consistently moving past runners, some of whom were really struggling in the heat because they clearly weren't used to it. Some had actually stopped running altogether and just put their hands on their knees, while others just sat on the ground, unable to get up. So basically everything was playing out exactly the way Lazaro expected it to. He was, making his move slowly but surely towards the front of the pack. However, as great as this race was going for Lazaro, something changed at around the 19-mile mark. He just felt really off. His legs got a really heavy, just like lead feeling, and a few minutes later, his vision started to get blurry. Lazaro kept on running and, told himself he was fine, and that this was just, late race fatigue kicking in. And for what it's worth, it is pretty common for marathon runners to say that at about the 19 to 20 mile mark, that's sort of the real halfway of the race, not the 13-mile mark. The 20-mile mark is where your body really starts to struggle. That last 6 miles is notoriously brutal. And so he's basically saying that, that's normal. This happens when you hit about 20 miles. And so as Lazaro worked as hard as he could to put one foot in front of the other and just to keep on going, he began telling himself that, this was worth it. At the end of this, there was a stadium packed with people who would be screaming his name, and he was still making such great progress. He could still win this race. But then, just a little bit later, his legs went from feeling heavy to just completely giving out. And he slammed to the ground, and then his whole body began to convulse. Within the hour, at a local hospital, an emergency doctor greeted a crew of Olympic medical staff as they wheeled in a man on a stretcher. They explained that this man was named Francisco Lazaro, and he'd collapsed in the middle of the marathon. And the doctor was really not surprised by this. He knew the Olympic paramedics had been swamped all day, helping other marathon runners who'd gotten sick from this really oppressive heat. However, as soon as this doctor began specifically examining Lazaro, he knew that this case was different and was much, much more serious. His other patients that day had all relatively mild symptoms like sweating and general fatigue and dizziness, which had easily been cured by providing water and cooling them off. But Lazaro, he was twitching and convulsing, and he was shouting deliriously that he'd won the race. So the doctor rushed him into an exam room and took his temperature. And when he saw it was 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit, he knew this situation was critical. A temperature that high was often fatal, and Lazaro's organs were likely already shutting down. And so the doctor yelled for nurses and other medical staff to bring in some water and some ice, but Lazaro, he did not respond to the hospital's treatments. And as the hours passed by, Lazaro actually got worse. The doctor and his team, they worked through the night treating Lazaro and trying to stabilize him. But the next morning, Lazaro died. After Lazaro's death, that doctor just could not shake the idea that something just felt off about Lazaro's death. Heat stroke can definitely be deadly, and Lazaro had seemed to have a very bad case of heat stroke, but lots of runners had gotten heat stroke during this marathon, and all of them had wound up being fine. So the doctor ultimately decided to run some tests on Lazaro to see if maybe there was something else that had been going on, like maybe there was some underlying illness or other factor that was to blame for his death. And when the doctor finally did get those tests back, the results made Lazaro famous. So remember, Lazaro had put a lot of thought into how to prepare for this big race. He trained extremely hard, he ate right, he chose the right clothes, the right shoes, and critically, he took very specific measures to protect himself from the heat, which he knew was going to be a factor. And at first, it seemed like all the measures he had taken in advance of this race had paid off. Especially when Lazaro looked down the line at the start, and he saw all the other runners were like pouring sweat and flush and just looking horrible. It just seemed like everybody was already exhausted before they had even started. But not Lazaro. He wasn't even sweating because of one of the precautions he had taken. But not sweating in this type of heat was actually a very bad thing. Sweat is the body's way of cooling itself down. So Lazaro's lack of sweat was actually a sign that he was in danger. And it was all thanks to Lazaro's extra strong sunscreen. Because it would turn out Lazaro was so prepared that he went out and found what he thought would be the best and most powerful sunscreen option ever. It was a substance called suet, which is a type of animal fat that's typically used in cooking or making candles and soap. It's also sometimes used for skincare, since it has a lot of nutrients and is generally good for the skin. And Lazaro believed that because suet is very thick, it would act as a barrier against the intensity of the sun. So he slathered a bunch of suet all over his body just before the big race. What he didn't anticipate was that this suet that was now all over him would work too well. It was so thick that it clogged the pores in his skin and prevented anything from passing through, even sweat. And without a way to cool itself down, Lazaro's body essentially turned into a furnace, which cooked him from the inside out. The weekend after Lazaro's death, the Olympics held a memorial service for him, and over 20,000 people attended to pay tribute to him. And it's probably not quite the type of fame he had hoped for, but Lazaro's name is still frequently referenced today in Portugal. The Portuguese refer to someone who looks sick and bedraggled as looking like Lazaro. On the morning of January 3rd, 2013, a 33-year-old man named Vladimir Sherbov stepped off a cable car at a ski resort in Russia. He was standing on the top of a snow-covered mountain, along with his friend Denis Barakov and Denis's wife, whose name was Yekaterina. Vladimir and Denis went to this resort all the time, usually to snowboard. But on this day, they were not here to snowboard. They were here to try out an exciting new ride that all their friends had been talking about recently. It had been Denis's idea to come, but Vladimir had been totally on board until now that he was actually seeing this new ride itself. So the ride was actually set up straight ahead of them at the very top of the beginner's ski slope. Now, where they got off from the cable car, it wasn't literally the very top of the mountain. It was like most of the way up. And when they got off the car, basically there was an additional stretch of mountain going up, not particularly steep, but that stretch from, the cable car to the top of this additional stretch was the beginner's slope. And so from where they're standing, having just gotten off, they'd be looking up, this beginner's slope. And the ride is right there. It's basically on that slope. And Vladimir, who's looking at the slope, he's looking at the ride, he could see the ride operator standing at the top of this slope, basically waiting for customers to go on this ride. But to Vladimir, it was kind of weird because, there wasn't really any signage for this new ride, and there was no line of people, at least that he could see, waiting to get on. And considering all the hype that Vladimir had heard about this ride recently, he'd expected something much bigger and more well advertised, where he could, potentially get up here and watch loads of other people do it first before he did it. And so suddenly, Vladimir couldn't help but have just sort of a bad feeling about this. Like, why isn't anyone else doing this ride? Like, what's going on here? And so he turned to his friend, Denise, and he said he had a bad feeling, and he really wasn't sure if he wanted to do this anymore. But Denise was like really excited about this, and he begged Vladimir not to bail on this yet. And, Vladimir could tell that Denise really was very excited. He wanted to try this ride, and he didn't want to do it alone. And so Vladimir was like, all right, fine. Like, let's go do it. And so Vladimir, Denise, and Denise's wife, Yekaterina, they walk from where they got off the car all the way to the top of this bunny slope. And again, there's no line for this ride. It's just this operator sitting up there waiting for anybody who wants to do this thing. And so the two men, they go up and they paid $10 to the operator, who then in turn said, okay, climb inside, because the riding compartment, if you will, could hold up to 2 people. And so both Denise and Vladimir climbed inside. And after they did that, Denise actually handed his phone off to his wife, Yekaterina, and he told her, take a video of us. I want to see, what this ride looks like from the outside. And so Yekaterina, she's got her phone. She's like, okay, and she hits record and she's filming. And then, Denise and Vladimir, they got tucked up fully inside of the compartment. The operator ensured it was ready to go. And then they were off. Now, back inside the ride, once this thing had actually begun, Vladimir was actually pretty happy he had agreed to go, because this was actually really fun. He was positioned in the riding compartment basically directly across from Denise, who, clearly he too was having a great time. He was laughing and screaming, and having a great time. But after just a few seconds, the ride seemed to change. It suddenly jerked to the left and then began going faster and faster and faster. Now, Vladimir and Denise had obviously never done this ride before, so they didn't know how it actually was supposed to feel. But Vladimir felt like there is no way this is how it's supposed to feel. This is out of control. We cannot be going this fast. This is dangerous. And so as Vladimir is really starting to worry, he looked over at Denise, who's only, a couple feet away from him, and he was not laughing and smiling anymore. He looked genuinely frightened. But before either man could really do anything at all, not that there was much they could do, the ride took one more horrible lurch, and then it just kind of slammed down hard, and then everything went black. It would turn out Vladimir's bad feeling he got when he first looked up at the bunny hill and, saw the ride basically unattended. No one was in line. No one was doing the ride. How could that be? His bad feeling about that was spot on, because the ride was not safe at all. In fact, it wasn't even legal. The operator, the one who actually put both men inside of the ride, had stolen the equipment that was the ride and then set it up in this wildly dangerous location with no safeguards. So this ride that the two friends were on was really just a giant inflatable ball called a Zorb. The idea, for this ride, for this experience, was that the riders would climb inside of the Zorb, almost like a human hamster ball, and then the Zorb would roll down the mountain like a huge slide. And it was supposed to be safe and fun, but it was not. And that's because the mountain that this ride was on was just way too steep and way too rough. This was a tragedy waiting to happen. And so as Denise's and Vladimir's Zorb went flying down the hill, it bounced a few times and then just totally veered off course. This is the video that Denise's wife captured from the top of that bunny hill, basically capturing their entire descent. You can see at some point one of the workers try to chase after the Zorb as it clearly just rolls away, but they can't keep up with it. And then in the final frames, you can see the Zorb speeding towards a cliff. The Zorb did ultimately go flying off that cliff, and as it plummeted through the air, Vladimir and Denise were ejected out of it. Vladimir was severely injured but would survive. As for Denise, unfortunately, he was killed. The ride operator was arrested, but they were given just a 4-year suspended sentence for the incident. This is a paid ad by BetterHelp. It's normal to long for a time when, connection felt easy and being close to people didn't take so much effort. And then you take a look at your life now and it just feels different, busier and more complicated. I mean, there are moments I think about sometimes, nothing big, just, sitting with people I cared about, talking about nothing. At the time, those moments themselves didn't feel important. But now, looking back, I think I'd tell that version of myself to cherish those moments as they were occurring because they don't last forever. And so someday, the relationships you have today may be the ones you wish you had held on to a little bit tighter. Therapy may be able to help you work through life's changes and provide the tools to navigate what's next, even if it looks different than it used to. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mr. Ballin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On April 22nd, 2025, an Indian tourist named Rishi Bhatt pulled a helmet onto his head at the top of a zipline platform in the Baisaran Valley, which is a meadow at the border of India and Pakistan. It was a very beautiful, sunny day, and way down below him, he could see crowds of people strolling around and having picnics on the grass and enjoying this awesome spring weather. However, as the zipline operator fastened the belt and rope around Rishi's waist, something started to feel off. The operator was a local man who looked pretty normal and unassuming, but he had been weirdly silent the whole time Rishi was standing in line, and it seemed like he was sort of preoccupied with something. And considering his job and how potentially dangerous it was, it just seemed like this should be his focus, getting people on and off this ride. But instead, Rishi noticed that this operator kept squinting down into the meadow really intently, like he was watching someone or something down there, but Rishi would look down and there was nothing down there that was unusual, so he couldn't understand why this operator was so fixated on whatever was going on down there. It just seemed like a normal day. And so by the time Rishi was told, he's ready to begin the ride here, he sort of felt like he didn't know if it was a good idea to trust this man with his safety. It just seemed like his mind was totally somewhere else. But Rishi had just watched a bunch of other people who had been, suited up by this guy, successfully navigate the zip line without any problems. And so ultimately, Rishi just sort of brushed off this budding anxiety inside of himself and just told himself he has nothing to worry about. This is going to be just fine. And so Rishi, when he was finally ready to go, he looked over at the other side to the other platform where he would eventually end up, where his wife and his 11-year-old son were, and he waved to them, sort of signaling he was going to start. And then he pulled out his phone and he hit record on the camera, and then he put it on his selfie stick and he sort of held it out, and then he jumped. And as you can see on Rishi's video, the first few seconds that capture him sort of beginning this ride, he was totally exhilarated. He's flying through the air over these breathtaking mountain views. The sun's on his face. He's laughing. But after about 20 seconds or so, Rishi heard that same zipline operator shout something from behind him. And so Rishi, he turns around and he looks back at this operator who again is sort of fixated looking down at the meadow below. And he's clearly looking at something down there really intently like he had been, but now it seemed much more urgent. And so Rishi looked from the operator down to the meadow as well, and what he saw was horrifying. He saw all these people who just moments before had been having picnics and having this just nice casual family time. They're all screaming and running off into the trees. And at first, Rishi just couldn't understand what was happening. But then, like all the other people in the valley, he heard this terrifying noise. And suddenly he knew what was going on. When Rishi reached the end of the zip line, he immediately ripped off the belt around his waist, and he grabbed his wife and his son, and they began to run. Here is the video that Rishi took that day. So the people below him, as he starts down the zip line, were mainly tourists, like Rishi and his family. And most of them, like Rishi, were from India, the country that actually has control over the area where that valley is located. And here, you can see them all start to run. What you don't see, and what we are actually blurring out here, are the 4 anti-India militants who suddenly opened fire in the valley beneath Rishi. The terrifying noise that Rishi and everyone else heard was gunfire. And the shout that Rishi heard from that sort of distracted zipline operator, well, Rishi would come to believe that that had actually been a call to action for the militants to begin their attack, like the operator was in on it. Rishi and his family would survive this attack, but unfortunately, this was a massacre. 26 people, almost all of them Indian tourists, were killed. On the afternoon of February 20th, 2014, 27-year-old Sarah Jones walked toward a bridge that was way out in the woods of Wayne County, Georgia. The film crew that she worked with was setting up on the bridge and on the banks of the river nearby, and Sarah could also see the director pacing around looking really stressed and kind of jittery and was clearly barking out lots of orders to everybody around him. And Sarah was also feeling pretty stressed herself. But she took a deep breath and she told herself she just had to make it through a few more hours of this and then she could go home. So Sarah was a camera assistant, and for the longest time she'd worked in television, but recently she'd been hired to work on a movie, and the movie was being shot out here in the woods. And this job was going to be very different than what she was used to. But not just because it was the difference between movie and TV. No, it had to do with budget. So this was a movie, that was sort of prestigious in a way, but it was going to be a really low budget movie that was called Midnight Rider. And the director sort of seemed like a total mess. He kept changing his plans all the time, especially at the last minute. And today, he had just begun outright lying to the crew. Just that morning, he told the whole crew, Sarah included, that they were heading out to this location in the woods just for a quick camera test to make sure the lenses and the lighting were right, but they weren't going to be doing any real filming. This was just pure testing. But once they got out to the bridge, the director sort of inexplicably changed his mind and said, actually, you know what, forget the test. We are going to do real filming today. We're going to shoot the whole scene for this bridge today. And this was a really weird thing to lie about. And Sarah just didn't understand what this guy's problem was. It just seemed odd the way he was going about this. But now, it was almost 4:30 p.m. and Sarah was carrying a bag of camera lenses over to the bridge to hopefully set up for their final shots of the day. And on her way, she happened to pass by the makeup artist, whose name was Joyce Gilliard. And she noticed that Joyce had a very strange expression on her face. And so Sarah stopped and actually asked Joyce what was wrong. She's like, you look worried, what's going on? But Joyce just shook her head and said she had this funny feeling that they really were not supposed to be here. But, just a minute later, Sarah had changed the lens on the camera and she was looking through the viewfinder, and this is what she saw. The cast and crew were on this narrow bridge made of wood and metal, and there was a rickety metal hospital bed right in the middle of the bridge. It was a prop. The scene was supposed to be this dream sequence about the main character's dead brother. So the actor playing the brother was lying on the hospital bed, and the actor playing the main character was standing a little further down the bridge with a guitar slung over his shoulder. And so once everyone was in their places, Sarah passed the camera to the cinematographer, and he hoisted it onto his shoulder, and the director called for the crew to start rolling. However, at the same time, there was this deafening roar and a blast of loud noise, and Sarah felt this deep vibration through her whole body. And it was so disorienting that at first she couldn't even tell what direction it was coming from. But when she turned around, she saw the director motioning frantically for everyone to get off the bridge. And so Sarah slung the camera bag over her shoulders and tried to run, but the bridge was so crammed with people and equipment and props that she couldn't get through. And before she knew it, that horrible sound was on top of her. It would turn out Joyce was right. They weren't supposed to be there that day, but not because of anything spooky or superstitious. It was because the film crew literally was not legally allowed to be shooting a movie on this bridge. So that was the reason why the director had changed plans that day and lied about what they were doing. Because his application for a permit to film on that bridge had been denied that morning. But he knew if he told his crew that it was denied, they wouldn't then be okay with going out there and doing it anyways. And so he just sort of didn't tell anyone and sort of forced the crew to do it. He tricked them all to do it, basically. But it's like the director and his crew, they're out there on the bridge, the cameras are rolling, they're about to film this final scene when disaster strikes. And the disaster that strikes was entirely predictable. It was literally the thing that this permit was denied because of. It was to avoid this type of disaster. Here is the last footage ever shot for Midnight Rider. You can see the actors and the crew scrambling to get themselves and this hospital bed off the bridge, and you can hear the roar and the blast of noise. Sarah is actually just out of frame. She's right behind the person who's holding this camera. And you can see right here the specific reason why the permit was denied. Because this bridge was an active railroad track, and there is literally a train barreling down on them. In the last few seconds of this footage, you can see the camera sort of tumbles. That's when the crew members who could not make it off the bridge in time instead pressed themselves up against the metal girders, trying to get as small and as sort of skinny as possible to avoid being hit by this train. But Sarah, unfortunately, was not fast enough. When the train came screaming by, it hit that hospital bed, and a piece of debris from it flew towards Sarah and pulled her back onto the tracks, directly into the path of the train. She was killed instantly. The rest of the crew that were on the bridge that day would survive, but a few other crew members were injured. As for the film's director, who put his whole crew in this awful situation, he pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter for Sarah's death, and he was ultimately sentenced to 2 years in prison.